From a cursory glance, regional cooperation in Southeast Asia flourished out of the interest in benefiting from mutual development and stability. In fact, that was one of the key contributing factors that went into the formation of ASEAN. And what was that? To see the improvement of economic, political, and social cooperation amidst the backdrop of post-colonialism, induced uncertainty, major power rivalries, and of course at that time the rise of communism. Indeed, now I'm taking it to a broader level. For regional security cooperation, and at an even broader level, let's say the Asia-Pacific, the platitude, forgive me for being a bit cynical by using that term, if not sheer rhetoric, has been sounded often enough to say this. It is said that the establishment of a regional architecture well fortified and equipped to ensure that all nations in the Asia-Pacific region are not deprived of the freedom to advance in terms of military vigor and resilience. I mean, this is a so-called rhetoric sounded enough by some of the global powers. There's no need to name names here, but I think if you put two and two together, you know who we're talking about. So at this level, your strategic thinking would enable you to deduce who are the parties, because they say one thing and do something else. So the mantra goes on to say there are three key elements of such a regional security architecture: inclusiveness, openness, and transparency. Further, it would fail, such a regional architecture would fail if, in the absence or if there isn't sufficient platform for free and open discourse on the issues that impact the region, so that collective and collaborative action may be taken. And here perhaps I can quote Hamlet when he says, "To die, to sleep perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub." That is the very quandary we're talking about. Inclusiveness, openness, transparency. I want you to put this at the backdrop as we discuss the utility of the ADMM and possibly other forms of architecture. All right, you can see the kind of, it's not cynicism, the kind of, shall we say, raising the question now when we're dealing with this topic. Now, that's because the declarations so far of aspirations on ASEAN regional cooperation, not even defense yet, have basically shied away from defense-centric language. You can study all the various statements, you will find that they are very shy of using defense-centric or security-centric language. While the task of articulation is largely delegated to foreign and trade ministers, officers of the Prime Minister's departments, presidents, or other heads of governments. Consequently, it has conditioned these actors to become averse to venturing into substantial defense cooperation on a wider ASEAN level. They were careful to avoid any quote-unquote misconceptions that ASEAN could develop into a military bloc. This is important. Think about this. There's a certain, I wouldn't use the word paranoia, but there is that circumspection, the worry that what they say may end up putting ASEAN within the paradigm as if it were a military bloc. That is the kind of caution they are trading in. So from that itself, you can analyze the constraints that we will be facing. Okay, historically speaking, Southeast Asia's experience with defense-related collaboration has remained at the bilateral level. Since the 50s, it has been slow to develop as the issue remains the majority of ASEAN member states are not prepared, or even willing to act for broader strategic matters. Past multilateral examples you are familiar with the area. I just go through the rigmarole. You have Seattle, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Curiously, of course, externally imposed, included only two Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines and Thailand. Then you have the Malaysian Defense Agreement, AMDA, and of course, the very famous or infamous, depending on where you're coming from, the FPDA, the Five Power Defense Arrangement. Now, as for the FPDA, the Five Power, one could argue that it partially answers, not totally, just partially answers the question raised earlier about the quandary of fulfilling aspirations. In that this arrangement does have a role, has a certain role, in promoting, if not directly, at least constructively. What is that? To the regional security architecture. That is an argument that can be used. What stands out more is that individual member states have their own security arrangements with different military powers. That's the point we need to raise here. So perhaps in the context of ADMM, when officers or those involved are discussing in the sidelines, that should be at the backdrop when you discuss certain things with your counterparts. The Philippines and Thailand are now non-NATO treaty allies of the US. Malaysia and Singapore are members of the FPDA, with Australia, NZ, New Zealand and the UK. And Brunei has a security arrangement with the United Kingdom after gaining independence. On the other hand, you have Laos, you have Vietnam and Myanmar. Due to differing political ideologies and separate waves of political developments, they have openly rejected joining any military alliance with any external powers. Please correct me if I'm wrong later during Q&A. Now, in light of this, what is the question that we raise? How can we open the path towards a truly holistic outlook on cooperation, where we can include defense elements without feeling paranoid or without feeling that somebody is saying that we are looking excessively into the prevention of conflict? How can we do this? It can also be argued that over time, ASEAN's evolution allowed for a natural progression to include defense-related cooperation despite past aversions. The foundation has already been laid, sustained by the ongoing assumption that an established history of collaboration, regardless of perhaps the level of sophistication, will open more opportunities for deeper cooperation. In other words, when you have a start, you should let it go and not be the stumbling block by being the usual critic in the corner saying, this is useless, what a waste of time. Let's now take on the constructive, the positive side. ASEAN defense establishments gradually made its way into the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, in 1994. This complemented, of course, the ASEAN Chiefs of Army multilateral meeting, the ACAMM, since 2000. And of course, the list goes on. Yeah, I'm not going to, bore you with the different names. That's already documented well. The point I want to make is that the next breakthrough was, of course, the 10th ASEAN Summit in Vientiane, 2004, where ASEAN leaders adopted the ASEAN Security Community Plan of Action. And of course, lo and behold, in May 2006, we witnessed the very first ADMM in Kuala Lumpur. So historically, there's some significance there. And when we talk in terms of perspective, we need to trace it back there, look into the antecedents of how it finally, and then we can know what it will move into in terms of its forward trajectory. Now, before I deep dive into the inherent drawbacks, before I take out the sword and plunge in for the kill, let us be more balanced here. Let us perhaps talk about the positives. Yeah? I think one standout feature which nobody can deny about the ADMM is that it marked the formalization, like I said, of multilateral defense diplomacy and cooperation. It's good to have a structure once you have got the strategy. Maybe later I'll be talking about the difference between structure and strategy, or whether it should be strategy first and structure. So in any event, these were the circumstances that we have top level. That's a key point. Yeah? One of the few platforms that host top level ministerial defense and security mechanisms directly accountable to the ASEAN leaders. Now that's a strong point. It is also the only platform that annually convenes all 10 defense ministers, while previous engagements have been concentrated amongst foreign policy agencies or through direct military-to-military transactions or interactions. Such arrangements soon expanded to the ADMM+. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. A platform for ASEAN and its 8 dialogue partners. So since 2017, the ADMM Plus has met annually to allow for enhanced dialogue and cooperation. You'd be surprised what the ADMM has done and possibly can do, especially the dialogue partners. We'll go into that later. Purportedly to strengthen security and defense cooperation for, quote-unquote, peace, stability, and development in an increasingly challenging regional security environment. And that is true, increasingly challenging. In addition to defense-related dialogue and cooperation, they are to advise senior defense and military officials on cooperation within ASEAN and its dialogue partners. Here again, to build mutual trust and confidence. That's really a huge task. I'm sure you agree. To build mutual trust and confidence in defense and security issues through the promotion of understanding and transparency. This will further the establishment of the political security community. Of course, you remember there were 3 pillars, of the ASEAN 2015 vision. This is the political security community. The next is, of course, the so-called the ASEAN economic community, and then the third is the social cultural community. Now, the key issues of cooperation, namely maritime security, counter-terrorism, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, peacekeeping operations, military medicine, humanitarian mine action, and cybersecurity, largely operate through the EWGs, that is the experts working groups. I think that's about the list that I have for the positives. So now let's get critical, or shall I say, let's try to use a military term, let's move into the killing zone. Yes. Now, as the saying goes, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Always remember that. As a strategist, always think between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. You have a great strategy, the idea is very good, the reality, there's a large shadow. Your task is to make sure you see the shadow and get into the light. So here, in spite of these activities, what we just said now, the off-stated goals, the aspirations, there are several persistent concerns that continue to limit the depth and potential of ASEAN's defense cooperation, hence the ADMM, including the ADMM+. First, much like its parent organization ASEAN itself, the ADMM and the ADMM Plus are scrutinized for perceived ineffectiveness and shallow levels of engagement. So for those of you who are really in the thick involvement of this is not a criticism against you. This is an observation by third party and those, of course, who are slightly more critical. Yeah. So they put them under a magnifying glass and start looking for faults. So you are scrutinized for perceived ineffectiveness and shallow levels of engagement. Therefore, to retain relevance, I would suggest these platforms need a proper appraisal of ongoing concerns, third-party validations, so that you take the necessary steps to mitigate the negative perceptions. And this is where think tanks, even like this college itself, perhaps working with others like ourselves, should be able to come up with more objective reports and assessments. It's always easy to criticize, but what is the solution? That is where we're going at. Number 2, ASEAN has been unable, I repeat, unable to regulate the competitive dynamic without jeopardizing overall cooperation among ADMM plus members. So what is the remedy for that? Steps need to be taken to ensure that the interests of dialogue partners, I'm being very critical here, and dialogue partners would not like to hear this, but let me just say this, yeah? Because of this problem about dealing with the dynamics of competition, therefore steps have to be taken, yeah, to ensure that the interests of dialogue partners do not supersede those of the ASEAN member states. Don't you think so? Yeah, do not supersede. You know, I have to say, anecdotally we know, this is said that the DPs, the dialogue partners tend to be more vociferous, more vocal, sometimes even combative in the language, yeah, in articulating their perspectives and positions, of course, naturally to advance their own country-centric agenda. That is to be expected. So question, how do you deal with that? It therefore stands to reason that ASEAN member states themselves, ASEAN member states, not the DPs, ASEAN, should factor in considerations to sustain the political will to do what? To speak as a collective front and retain control of the ADMM plus process. And here I might mention, for those who are pretty familiar with the process and substance of military intelligence, you find that unknowingly subversion will be taking place. Subversion is not just about spies and blowing up bridges, as you know. Subversion is just casual conversation to weaken the positions of certain other parties, to break down this collectiveness. That is one part that we have to look into. Number 3, these platforms have been rather static. Now, we know, 4th Industrial Revolution, things are moving. In a world where things are so moving fast, dynamically, those who stay still literally are going backwards. So if you look within this spectre, particularly in this area, in terms of that, the platforms are static. They need to move beyond tackling the less controversial security concerns. Move beyond that. Don't just look at the safe issues. Don't just look at things that you think there will always be a consensus. The whole idea is to break that and see the areas that you disagree and find some convergence of the mind. They cannot afford to remain stagnant. Its members need to adjust to the new and continuously changing strategic environment and incorporate new ideas and new areas of cooperation into the ADMM. So if you're involved in that, that could be one of the key areas. You want to think about it. Go have a real brain battling session and then come up with new ideas and propose. Again, it must come with political will, as without it, it will only remain as wishful thinking. Number 4, we have also observed that ASEAN's track record has not been the most encouraging, particularly in matters of geopolitical and geostrategic import. It betrays a penchant, or as the French would say, a penchant for grandiloquent statements, really grandiloquent statements of process without much to show in terms of substantive investments or achievements. This is not an indictment against ASEAN per se as a whole. I have been involved in ASEAN, I've been involved in MITI, I know the actual achievements. The AEC, for example, in terms of that, even though not really solid, concerted, lots of things have been done in terms of economic diplomacy and in terms of the achievements cross-country, cross-border. The numbers will show that it's doing very well. So that part. But this, yes. For example, in July, let me go back to being critical now. Yeah, Australia, New Zealand, and the US withdrew from the ADMM Plus Experts Working Group. Remember I talked about Experts Working Group? They withdrew. And that Experts Working Group was very crucial because it was on counter-terrorism. If you recall, that's last year. ASEAN member states need to invest in resources for the long term because of this huge gap. Now, despite being home to one of the fastest growing economies in the world, their defense budgets, I'm talking about ASEAN collectively, remain small, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. In 2021, the countries of Southeast Asia collectively spent $43 billion USD on defense. Collectively, $43 billion. And you know what that is? That's only 2% of the global defense spending. Now, the incompatibility is also found in supply of arms. In the past 2 decades, Russia has been the largest supplier of arms to Southeast Asia, which has amounted to 11 billion in sales since 2000, compared to the United States, surprisingly, 8.4 only, 8.4 billion. Now, Southeast Asia will need to take stock of its capabilities to make viable investments in capacity building and narrow the gaps between its members of seamless cooperation. Even between the members, there's a huge. Now, number 6, ASEAN's institutional weakness can be seen in the inability to tackle controversial matters troubling the region, considering the unlikelihood of resolving issues, for example, territorial disputes. These member countries, what should be done? They will need to prepare risk mitigation measures to manage any accidents or unforeseen or miscalculations. Broadly speaking, militaries and defense establishments should take the necessary steps to safeguard against potential escalation of tensions. There needs to be stricter adherence to existing agreements and mechanisms. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, we are very familiar with that. The Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, not so well known, of course, and direct, except for those in the Navy, and direct communication links. Beyond policy level considerations and discussions, the ADMM needs to enhance cooperation and relations among the respective militaries, as they are most often going to be the first ones on the ground in responding to an interstate dispute. That is where the importance of the military cannot be overstressed. Absolutely important, because the first and also even the very last line. Now, when all is said and done, there are some developments that remain beyond ASEAN's immediate control. So we just can't lay it all on ASEAN, even on the military side, even on the defense side, even on the so-called political defense side. For instance, major power rivalry. By virtue of their capabilities and influence, this will continue to be one of the most crucial sticking points for resolution of differences and disputes in the region. An overriding and most pressing issue centers, of course, on the ongoing Sino-US conflict. It's absolutely beyond ASEAN's control. Now, in respect, of course, of the South China Sea and the related areas of dispute, the evolution of this major power relationship will have serious implications for countries like Malaysia, the smaller countries in the region. Many of these countries maintain close trade and investment and, in some sense, security ties with both these superpowers. So that is where the dilemma is, and that is where the quandary many ASEAN member states are in. For one, what does this policy in the grand strategy context? So in these circumstances that we're talking about, the question is asked, what should be the grand strategy context? It means that ASEAN should need to keep the United States and China invested in the ASEAN-led security architecture. This was an issue noted in the stymied progress of the South China Sea. Unfortunately, there was this disputed related discussions, and nothing fruitful came out of it. And this has persisted till this very day. And because of that, they have allowed the great powers to start doing their own thing, fortify their respective positions in the region. And the thing becomes now increasingly a boiling cauldron, a flashpoint. All you need is just a lightning rod. So we see escalating posturing from the American side, marking the first time in 3 decades where the Philippines, very familiar, this is very recent, right? Announced that they were giving the United States access to 4 more military bases in the country. alongside building new facilities and placement of armaments. Well, China is not exactly, letting the grass grow under her feet. Now, similarly, China has been making progress in defense relationships, ranging from announced plans to develop an air defense center and expand the radar system in Cambodia, to Malaysia's purchase of Chinese naval vessels. We are witnessing other countries such as Japan, India, and even those in Europe showing increased interest in the region. Now, this poses additional risks to the theoretically multilateral status quo. Bear in mind, we're talking about multilateral status quo, some in theory, some in fact. Now, the proliferation of quote-unquote mini-lateral, I think that's more the focus. Yeah, the proliferation of mini-lateral groupings such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which you're familiar with, of course you have AUKUS, yeah, and the like. Now, these are pulling focus further away from the regional architecture of Southeast Asia. So the question is, how can Southeast Asia really maintain its strategic core, and particularly ASEAN, in view or in light of the utilitarian purposes of the ADMM and ADMM+. No quick answers but given, but this is just a critical view of it. Aside from major power rivalry, there is the protracted and emergent security challenges that have been inadequately addressed, at best, and ignored in the West. Some of the notable challenges have been border and territorial disputes, illegal migration, refugee flows, transnational criminal activity. We should also take on traditional areas of security such as health, climate, energy, and economic security as seriously, as these can further exacerbate weaknesses in governance and administrative functioning. Observers have also highlighted strategic challenges such as the ongoing territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the crisis in Myanmar. In the case of the South China Sea, of course, little tangible progress has been made because of the lack of quote-unquote collective interest, and that's crucial. In cases like this, once you don't have this collective interest, things will dissipate left, right, and center. And without that force, nothing can be resolved. In the case of Myanmar, member states have shown divisiveness over the severity and institutional response to the military junta and whether they should be recognized. Now, just let me pause a little bit and talk about Myanmar. I'm sure you're aware of Malaysia's position on Myanmar. I will just give a brief note. As you know, the first statement given by the Prime Minister was in Bangkok. He made the famous statement about carving out, if you remember, carving out Myanmar because of the atrocities. And then people thought this was maybe a slip of the tongue, maybe a one-off utterance. No, he doubled down in Manila, said it again, why it's important. Yeah, he made the point about ASEAN centrality is important, but neutrality is not a license for indifference, and that's a key point. The example given is, of course, like I said earlier, you see your very close door, next door neighbor being clobbered to death by a bunch of muggers, blood spilling into your compound, and you say, hang on, I'm neutral, I can't do anything. So that's the rationale. And then he said it in Beijing in response, and also some statements in the board dialogue and the forum in Hainan. And lastly, of course, in Labuan Bajo, the Leaders Summit. He went on to the Deal with Myanmar agenda. Unfortunately, you do not have a collective voice there. I don't want to name countries, but we know those some who are in, some who are not in. Indonesia is going along strongly. So this is the structural weakness within the system itself. Like I said, it shows divisiveness on the severity of the institutional response. So ADMM, ADMM+, when you want to talk about Myanmar, what you should do, you are constrained by this Achilles heel. With such ongoing developments, there are questions as to what the future of defense cooperation in Southeast Asia and the wider region would look like. Now, we should use the existing bodies, meaning the ASEAN and the related agencies, including this platform, FPDA, the Five Power Defense Arrangement, to provide insight into Western military's latest concepts and doctrines, supplementing what we gain from our engagements with the United States. Such transfers of know-how, if possible, are unlikely to happen in the case of ADMM and ADM+. We should also view the Five Power Defense Arrangement as providing a countervailing force should any regional country behave or develop in unexpected ways. We should also consider looking into other regions and learning from their experiences, their struggles, and their successes. For example, the African Union and their model of regionalism. Ineffectiveness saw the transformation of the organization of the African Union to the African Union, where the legal framework allows the organization, this is important, the legal framework, and this is where ASEAN's legal framework lacks. Here, the legal framework in the case of the African Union allows the organization to intervene in a member state. Intervene. Legal framework allows them to intervene. It's very important. Yes? Yes. Following a decision by the Assembly of the Heads of State. In case of international crimes or when members request intervention to restore peace and security. Am I right? Finally, all this depends on whether there is a willingness to make the difficult decisions for the betterment of these platforms. Perhaps this is where we should seek the intersection of economic diplomacy with defense diplomacy. Why must we bifurcate? Defense, people are thinking about war, bullets and butter, etc. Don't think of that. Think of, the butter part will be the economic diplomacy. Think about that. We need to go beyond conventional forms of defense diplomacy and exhibit proactiveness to ensure that the region maintains its peaceful stability so that we are free to pursue our national interests. And that would necessarily entail economic progress, not in the self-centered zero-sum game sense, but in the inclusive framework of shared prosperity.